Hi Founder fans, Jason here. I forgot to put up my save screen so you just saw me get warmed up with my vocals. So thank you for coming. Welcome to Founder of the Day. If you're new here, this is the weekly update on the American Revolutionary War. I'm going to fix my mic real quick. Obviously I wasn't quite ready to go live, but that's okay. So what I do here if you're new is I discuss the last 7 articles I published on my website, founderoftheday.com, where I talk about obscure American stories of the American Revolution and unheralded American founders and try and paint an ever-expanding canvas of the American Revolution. So, without further ado, thank you everyone joining us. Hi Matt, I see you there. Let's get started. So, now that I'm completely throwing myself off guard right away, we're going to pop this up, and this, our first founder, is Doohickey Arundel. Now I have to pop up my notes here while we talk, but Doohickey Arundel is kind of a nobody, but he's a very interesting character. He was a French person who apparently has Irish lineage. He was often also written as Louis O'Hickey de Arundel. So a unique combination of French and Irish name there, but generally he's referred to as Doohickey Arundel. As Matt, you had pointed out privately to me, we had stumbled onto this person about the same time. He spoke very little English, but he was fluent in French and German, and he was still commissioned by the Continental Congress on the recommendation of Benjamin Franklin to join the artillery. And he first went north to meet with Philip Schuyler and Charles Lee, but he would later follow Charles Lee south to Virginia. Unfortunately for Mr. Doohickey, very early in the war, or I should say Mr. Arundel, very early in the war, he had an idea. So they were down in Virginia, and they were at what became known as the Battle of Gwynn's Island. Gwynn's Island, an island off the coast of Virginia, where the royal governor of Virginia, Dunmore, there it is, couldn't find the name, Lord Dunmore, he fled Virginia because the rebels had taken over, but he wanted to have a stand and he wanted to try and take back Virginia. It would look very bad for him returning to Great Britain and saying, "Whoopsie daisy, lost your biggest colony." Oh well, bye. So he attempted to take it back, and this was done unsuccessfully at the Battle of Gwynn's Island, where actually in this little known battle the Americans absolutely dominated the battle. And the only person that they lost, one man, there was one known American casualty, and it was our friend Doohickey Arundel. Fortunately for Mr. Doohickey, he built a mortar made out of wood. A mortar being basically a cannon it shoots bombs. It's not quite a cannon. For those of you who are not versed in military weaponry, which I usually am not. I did a little bit of research into it. It's one of those cannons that are there and you drop it in and it shoots out and then it explodes somewhere else. Preferably, unfortunately, Doohickey Arundel built this doohickey, for lack of a better term, that everyone around him, all the Continentals were saying, no, 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 no. Please don't shoot that off. You're going to kill yourself. And he said, I got it. This is going to be great. And it blew up and he killed himself right in front of everyone. That is the one sad spot of the Battle of Gwynn's Island. And interestingly, I do have a letter here. John Page, an important revolutionary in Virginia and a lifelong friend of Thomas Jefferson, wrote to Jefferson informing him of the ordeal. And he, quote, "No one seems to regret the loss of Arundel, who lost his life by the bursting of a wooden mortar which was foolishly constructed, and he obstinately persisted in his resolution to fire, though dissuaded from it by everyone who saw it." Yes, Matt, hold my beer. Exactly. It's an extraordinary, interesting thing. Now, in my article this week, I actually did something I don't usually do, and I kind of made a guess at something historical. His name was Doohickey, and that is very strange. A strange name, and also that he built a contraption or a gadget, which are other words for doohickey, a thing without a name, an invention without a name, is also known as a doohickey. And I made that connection. I said, well, I wonder if this is where the word doohickey comes from. So I looked into it, and unfortunately, it seems like no. The first recorded use of the word doohickey was in a book in 1814. And this is about almost 150 years before Doohickey made his doohickey and blew himself up. It does seem to have been in use on ships synonymous with gadget throughout the latter half of the 19th century, the latter half of the 1800s. But it does not seem to have been written down or used before that. Now, is it possible that this is when people started saying, "Oh, that's a doohickey," making fun of this guy, and that was just used linguistically for a century and a half before it was written down? It's possible, but that's a very long time for something to be in the lexicon without actually being documented. So I do doubt it, as much fun as that would have been for all of us. I will say I doubt that is how it actually ended up, but I do think it's fun. I did really appreciate this John page, because there are a bunch of founders. If you go to Founders Online, there are a bunch of founders referencing Arundel blowing himself up, and they're all like, "We were saying no, don't do it, you're going to die." And I shouldn't laugh at his demise. I know I shouldn't, but it's quite silly. I also want to note it seems to be Arundel, not Arendelle, as in the main city in the movie Frozen. It is spelled differently. Okay, but we're going to continue on here. We're going to pop up another founder number 2. Whammy, Melancton Smith. Now, those of you who are regular viewers know that after a long time doing Federalist Fridays and reviewing Federalist papers, I now do Anti-Federalist Fridays, where I cover different anti-Federalist documents. And this week we covered Plebeian. And now a Plebeian was written by Melancton Smith. Melancton Smith, a very interesting founder. He was friends with many of the anti-Federalists, especially the delegates to the Constitutional Convention from New York. Robert Yates and John Lansing, who left the Constitutional Convention early and came home and said, "This is terrible, let's get rid of this." Melancton Smith sided with them, and he became arguably the most active writer in New York among the Anti-Federalists, and arguably the most active among all Anti-Federalists, because not only did he write a Plebeian, but he also there was someone a few years back who used computers to decipher the writings of some of the Federalist papers, specifically Brutus and Federal Farmer, which we covered a few weeks back. And a lot of the information on there, a lot of the style and the substance, according to the robots, indicates that Melancton Smith may have been the author of that. Now, upon human examination, combined with this evidence, the truth is Melancton Smith was probably corresponding heavily, and not even corresponding, sitting in rooms and talking to the authors of Brutus and Federal Farmer, and that's why his flair finds its way in there a little bit. Now, as for a Plebeian, he covers several things that are fairly common among anti-federalists, though he does word them very clearly. For example, the two main things he covers in a Plebeian are the evils under the the evils under the Confederation. Basically, the Articles of Confederation aren't as bad as everyone's making it out to be, and the Constitution must be drastically revised before adoption. So we'll break those down. First, he outright asks the reader, "What is your condition? How terrible is your life right now?" And the point being, okay, maybe the Articles of Confederation aren't perfect, but everyone's doing fine. So we might want to fix the Articles of Confederation, sure, but it's not quite so urgent as some of these Federalists would have you believe. Then he goes on to discuss the fact that the Constitution, or at least his opinion, I shouldn't say fact, his opinion that the Constitution should be drastically revised. And he wants it to be revised before it's adopted. Because the Federalists were initially saying, we should adopt the Constitution, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, there's nothing wrong with it, it's as good as we're going to get. And by the end of the ratification debates, the Federalists have changed their tune and say, okay, it needs amendments, as the musical Hamilton now famously says. So it needs amendments. That came on later. In that play, they do it very briefly, a year-long discussion in 2 sentences. They do it in 2 sentences. But yeah, it was because of the Anti-Federalists. They were saying, well, okay, well, let's get it through because the document itself has procedures to amend it. So let's pass it and ratify it, and then we'll make the appropriate amendments. And Melancton Smith comes out as a Plebeian, which I think is a hilarious name. No, we should make these amendments first. As he had already stated, there is no rush here. And so if we are going to make changes, let's make changes to the document and then say, oh, okay, now it's a document we like, and push that through. Interestingly, Melancton Smith would go on to be arguably the leader of anti-federalists during the New York's ratification debate. And he got a letter that I believe was from his friend Nathan Dane of Massachusetts, who is considered the father of American jurisprudence, but that's a different story that I do believe I made a video about, so check that out. And he gets a letter from Nathan Dane saying, like, listen, New York is last. Like, now New Hampshire has passed it, and so has Virginia and Massachusetts Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, the biggest, most important states, have passed it. And now that New Hampshire has passed it, it's ratified. So if you want to hang out with North Carolina and Rhode Island and not be part of the Union, good luck. But probably not the best bet, as opposed to joining right now. And while we're making these changes that everyone has said, okay, we'll make a Bill of Rights, you want to be involved in that or not? And that essentially changed Melancton Smith's mind. And when he changed his mind at the New York Convention, which, like most conventions, was very close, or at least most of the important conventions was very close, Melancton Smith changed his mind and essentially is the one who ends up steering New York to ratifying the Constitution. Though it's interesting, I have actually just earlier today heard arguments about if New York hadn't ratified, actually if New Hampshire hadn't ratified, New York probably wouldn't, and therefore the kind of union would have essentially dissolved, or at least the Constitution. But that's a different conversation for a different day. That is Melancton Smith, a plebeian, and also many other Federalist writings. So we are going to pop up here Daniel D. Tompkins, a name you don't often hear. Is, I will grant you, loosely affiliated with the American founding. He was the 6th Vice President of the United States, but he was Vice President for who I think is an obvious founder, James Monroe. Which, look out for some James Monroe content next week. I just wrote a really fun piece about that, but we're not going to get into that too much. We're talking about Daniel D. Tompkins. When Daniel T. Tompkins was 30 years old, he was a brilliant young lawyer, and at just 30 years old was elected to the United States House of Representatives. But he turned that down because by the time he was to be sworn into office, he had been elected to New York State Supreme Court. Just to indicate what kind of mind intelligence we're dealing with here, Daniel D. Tompkins, at 30 years old, turned down the United States House of Representatives to be on the New York State Supreme Court. And then, just a few years later, 3 years later, so when he was 33, he left the New York State Supreme Court because he went to be governor of New York State. And he would be governor for a full decade. And during this decade was the War of 1812. And I'll remind you that much of the War of 1812 was fought in New York, on the border of New York and Canada. We like to forget that, like, New York has a big border with Canada. And back then, when the country we had made the Louisiana Purchase, but no states on the other side of the Great Lakes, New York was the way to Canada. And he, as governor of New York, he was in control of all the militias that ran New York State. And he did a good job because they won the war, and he was commended. He came to national politics, not just for how he oversaw New York State's militia in fighting the war, but additionally, he spent his own personal money trying to raise troops, because the nation wasn't real wealthy yet. I mean, War of 1812, we're talking about James Madison still president. It's a young nation. It's not wealthy, though some people had great wealth, including people like Stephen Van Rensselaer, who we talked about not too long ago, who ended up being one of the wealthiest Americans of all time. Another person who invested a lot of money into the war, and a person who actually ran against Daniel D. Tompkins unsuccessfully, because people really liked Daniel D. Tompkins. So much so that come 1817, Daniel D. Tompkins is just 43 years old, and he runs to be vice president of the United States with James Monroe, and he successfully wins the presidency of James Monroe. I apologize. He successfully becomes vice president under James Monroe, the 6th vice president of the United States of America. And he's bored. And while he's vice president, he actually runs for governor of New York, which, side note, very interesting. This is the second time in, 10 years, 12 years that the same thing has happened, because, this is, 15 years. 16 years, got it. It's the second time in 16 years this has happened, because Aaron Burr, before him, was vice president for Thomas Jefferson, and he decided to run for governor of New York while he was vice president. Now, the difference is Aaron Burr lost and wasn't vice president anymore, and that was a whole different thing. Daniel D. Tompkins lost the race for governor this time, so he went to his fallback job, which was vice president of the United States. And he held on to that position throughout the entirety of the James Monroe administration. And in fact, I just learned, was the only vice president to have 2 full terms as vice president in the 19th century. Throughout the 1800s, Daniel D. Tompkins was the only person to serve 8 years as vice president. I know that sounds kind of strange. Part of that is some men died in office, and part of that is some men took over for presidents who passed away. Like Andrew Johnson, for example. So, sadly, after this, Daniel D. Tompkins kind of leaves public office. Again, after 8 years, he's in his early 50s now, but he's still accomplished everything except be president that you could do. I also should note that while most presidents up until this point were from Virginia, other than John Adams from Massachusetts, all presidents had been from Virginia. Most of the vice presidents had actually been from New York. Between Aaron Burr, and names are escaping me, Clinton and Daniel D. Tompkins, New York was kind of seen as a swing state, and because of that, it was used to pull in, to keep getting the Democratic Republican Party to vote for Democratic Republicans. They brought in a candidate from New York that would sway moderates who kind of didn't know who to choose in the swing state, would say, that guy's from my state, so I'll vote for him, which was very, very important to people back then. It's actually why it's in the Constitution that you cannot vote for a president and vice president from the same state. You might not realize. Legally, the president and VP cannot be from the same state. Hi, Una. Thank you so much for coming. Daniel D. Tompkins' ending is a little sad, because after he's vice president, for various reasons, having lost so much of his money during the war, boredom, and I know there are other reasons that are, he was disappointed to lose certain elections. So unfortunately, after being the 6th vice president of the United States, Daniel D. Tompkins takes to the bottle, and he ends his life, to be fair, while he was still vice president, he became an alcoholic. And he is the vice president to live the shortest amount of time after being vice president. Again, he is the only person to serve a full 8 years as vice president in the 19th century, and he's also the quickest to die, because he dies of alcoholism just 99 days after his term as vice president expires. That is the topsy-turvy life of Daniel D. Tompkins. So I'm going to pop up our next founder here, and I'm going to take a quick sip of water because I am talking and thirsty. And it is Timothy Pickering. Pickering. Now, if you've watched, if you happen to follow me on Twitter, you may have seen I had a good amount of conversation with a few people about the Pickering family over the last few days, and do look for at least one Pickering article in the coming weeks because of that, because I like to write about what I'm learning about, and I like to learn about what I'm learning about. But today we're going back to talk about Timothy Pickering. Timothy Pickering was a young Harvard graduate who was just got a job working in his town's clerk's office as a way to make his way up in life. And it was soon after this that he was appointed as a colonel in the local militia. While in the militia, things are starting to get heated with Great Britain, and Pickering writes a book titled An Easy Plan for Militia. I guess I should call it a pamphlet. But his Easy Plan for Militia ends up being taken by the Continental Army when it's formed, and it becomes the training manual of the Continental Army. Again, they're kind of cobbling together a Continental Army at the beginning, so they're cobbling together their training manuals, and they take okay, this guy Pickering won one, that's pretty good. So Pickering does join the revolution right off the bat. He ends up participating in several early standoffs, including Leslie's Retreat, which is a much overlooked standoff between the British and the regulars. The British and the Patriots just before the Battle of Lexington and Concord. After Lexington and Concord, Pickering goes out and participated in the siege of Boston. He works his way up in the army throughout the years. His Easy Plan for the Militia, that pamphlet I was talking about, that becomes the main guidebook until Baron von Steuben shows up and writes his Blue Book, which for a much longer time becomes the standard operating manual for the American Army. Pickering, for his part, he continues to make his rise through the ranks of the Continental Army. Eventually, by the end of the war, he takes over for Nathaniel Greene as Quartermaster General, which, again, is kind of basically makes him in charge of feeding all the troops. Though he did take over, feeding and supplying, I should say, though he did take over after the war was essentially over. But still, a really important position. I did forget to mention he was involved with putting the Great Chain across the Hudson. When the Newburgh conspiracy happens, where all the generals in Newburgh, New York are considering what to do about these guys in Congress in Philadelphia who are not paying them and going to disband the army, Washington famously comes in and reminds them what they were fighting for, liberty and republicanism, and everyone else is moved to tears and basically is embarrassed about who they are. Except Timothy Pickering, who looks around the room and says, wait, he comes in here and he says, now I gotta wear glasses because I'm old and we're all just gonna drop it? Like, what happened? We were all very upset just a few minutes ago. So I like to bring up that story to build Timothy Pickering's character. He did have beliefs and he stood by them and he was not easily swayed. It does come back to haunt him a little bit. When George Washington becomes president, he brings people into his cabinet. And Timothy Pickering is appointed as the first Postmaster General of the United States of America. And I know in modern politics the post office is a hot-button issue, but back then the post office was extraordinarily important, especially the position of Postmaster General. This is how communication was. You know, gentlemen on horseback, I suppose ladies on horseback too, but gentlemen on horseback carrying mail was the information superhighway. It was the internet of the day, and they needed to control it. They needed people to be able to receive mail somehow, especially when it came to things like military and militias. So Pickering gets into the first cabinet. He is technically a member of the inaugural cabinet of the United States of America. Years later, he ends up, he is sent to New York to negotiate a treaty of peace with the Iroquois Nation, and there have been, well, I guess that's a side story, but he starts the first real treaty of peace between the two. The Treaty of Canandaigua, it's called. He ends up being chosen as Secretary of War for a brief time by George Washington, and then is moved over to Secretary of State by George Washington. And Secretary of State is extremely interesting because Thomas Jefferson was the first Secretary of State, and he'd be the third president. And from there, every Secretary of State would go on to be president for a long time. Jefferson was Secretary of State, and then James Madison was Secretary of State, and James Monroe was Secretary of State, and John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State, and they all were presidents in a row, and that's why later on, the corrupt bargain, as Andrew Jackson would say, when the House of Representatives is deciding the presidential election for John Quincy Adams, well, part of the deal was he made Henry Clay Secretary of State because it indicated Henry Clay would then be in line to be the next president. That's not, in many ways, how we might think of vice president today in that fashion. I've gone a little off topic, but I wanted to prove again, Timothy Pickering was one of the major American founders. In fact, I'm trying to think about where I had him on my annual list of 100. He probably should have been higher, because of how urgent he was. Now, when John Adams comes in and takes over as president from George Washington, he famously keeps the same cabinet around. And among this cabinet is Secretary of State Timothy Pickering. Now, Timothy Pickering, along with his buddy, I make him sound like kids, along with his colleague, James McHenry, who was had several positions. Also, I believe Secretary of War for John Adams. I believe I might be wrong about that, but yeah, he wasn't he? Oh, this is gonna haunt me. Either way, they are. Alexander Hamilton has already left the administration at this point, but they are, for lack of a better word, part of Hamilton's team. I don't want to call them lackeys because they were, as I said, on their own, very impressive American founders. And I don't want to call them henchmen because that has evil connotations. But they were decidedly sided with Alexander Hamilton, and Hamilton publicly criticizes John Adams. And because of this, the McHenry and Pickering start trying to convince Adams to do things he doesn't want, kind of going behind his back. He famously fires them too close to the end of his term, unfortunately. Adams was trying to be as George Washington as he could be. And he, of all people, knew he was not a George Washington, but he tried to have that distanced, neutral position about being above this infighting politics. Unfortunately, the cabinet he inherited from George Washington didn't see things the same way and said, now that Washington's gone, we're going to do what Hamilton wants. Fortunately, unfortunately, he does get fired. Although, and from there, unfortunately, Pickering remains a diehard Federalist, and as the Jefferson becomes president and James Madison becomes president, and the Federalist Party gets faded out, Pickering does continue. He does spend time in the House of Representatives, and then he spends time as a United States Senator. So he doesn't disappear, but he does become a dying breed of Federalist. And then eventually he becomes associated with the Hartford Convention of 1812, where they were basically, 1814, where they basically came together, and New England kind of floated the idea, they didn't say it outright, but floated the idea of seceding from the Union. And then that becomes known just as we realize that they won the war of 1812, and it doesn't go well, so he retires from public life after that. But that's life of Timothy Pickering in super brief. He's an amazingly important American founder. I'm part of me surprised he's not better known, but then again, I'm surprised by that every 3 days. So let's pop up another founder. We are going to see Joseph Fenwick. Now, what's interesting this week is this is the first of two Joseph Fenwicks we will be talking about today. And I'm sure that's confusing, but you know what? I was confused when I saw two Joseph Fenwicks. Theoretically, there was a third, although his name was Benedict Joseph Fenwick, and he became an important early, I don't want to say bishop, I don't want to get it wrong, but he was a high-ranking Catholic priest. I forget his exact term, where he achieved, but he would go on, and this is a side note, bonus founder, Benedict Joseph Fenwick, ends up going to New York City and being important in establishing Catholicism there. Then he went to Boston and established a bunch of Catholic organizations, a bunch of schools, and he faced a lot of backlash. This is in like the 1820s and 30s, though. But he faced a lot of backlash and anti-Catholic sentiment and bigotry, which is an interesting story. Now, as far as Joseph Fenwick that we're talking about today, the Fenwick family of Maryland was a Catholic family, and they had Catholics had a very interesting place in the American Revolution. They did have a certain amount of freedom in Maryland that Catholics didn't necessarily get everywhere, especially sections of Catholicism, and I don't really want to get into, I don't know enough about the history of Catholicism in Europe to talk about it intelligently here, but my understanding is there were divisions of Catholicism, and that certain divisions weren't even welcome in Catholic Europe, and they found comfort in Maryland. And that's one of the reasons that the Catholics of America were so eager to join the revolution and commit to independence, was because they were afraid of some of the changes Britain was making to not necessarily to repress Catholics, but there was sentiment especially in New England, against, after the War of 1812, the French people in Canada were now British, and the King of England, with the Quebec Act, said you can be Catholic, it's cool. And a lot of people in New England were like, it's not cool. And a lot of people in Maryland were like, wait, but it's been cool this whole time. And independence gave them the opportunity to really stand up for themselves, because there was Catholics signed the Declaration of Independence, and the name escapes me, and the Constitution. Oh, and I'm really unhappy with myself, and I am going to bring it up because I'm really unhappy with myself. But I'm going to keep talking while I do it. Duplicate, and as it pulls up. So we're going to talk about Joseph Fenwick. I'm pulling it up. I'm doing it. Oh, man, I'm really unhappy with myself that I can't. Man, I would think about it and guess, but then I'm going to embarrass myself. Thomas Fitzsimmons was the Catholic at the Constitutional Convention, and Charles Carroll of Carrollton signed the Declaration of Independence, and he was the longest surviving member to sign the... Man, I can't believe I forgot Charles Carroll, because when I said Catholics in Maryland, my first thought was the Carroll family, because his brother John Carroll would be the first American archbishop, this and that, yada, yada, yada. So, now that that's out of the way, Joseph Fenwick was a Marylander who, after the Revolution, he did not do a whole lot. No, Sherman was as close to Puritan as you're going to get in the American founding, Matt. He was, I forget his exact denomination, but you might as well call him a Puritan. There's not much to say about that. He was also from Connecticut. Anywho, the Fenwick family. Joseph Fenwick, young man during the Revolution. I did not see of any participation in the war itself, but he's still a young man after the war, and he starts a firm with his brother James Fenwick and John Mason, a son of George Mason, who's a more famous American founder. And they start a trading firm. And Joseph goes to Bordeaux in France to head up the European side while his brother is in America. Meanwhile, John Mason kind of travels back and forth between the two. So, when George Washington becomes president, they decide to name consuls. Now, consuls are kind of like an ambassador to another nation, but they're specifically an ambassador to one particular city. And what they do, they don't have any real ability to negotiate anything, but they are in charge of all of the Americans in that city. Although theoretically it should happen in America right now. Like, I don't know if this is exactly how it works, but say there's a consul in New York City. New York City is not the capital of the nation, but there's a consul there. So if you are a British person in New York and you have some trouble with the law, you would go to the British consul in your city. Generally, at this point, it seems to have been port cities got consuls, but either way, Bordeaux is a city in France that had a major port, and they needed a consul there. And George Washington does end up choosing Joseph Fenwick. Now, I want a side note here, because a portion of my article talks about how he was chosen. George Mason, the famous founder who was at the Constitutional Convention and refused to sign the Constitution, and they kind of became an enemy of George Washington because he talked so much trash about the Constitution. He writes to George Washington saying, hey, I think this guy, Joseph Fenwick, in Bordeaux will be a great asset for you as consul. And he says a lot of nice things about him. I will also note that there's another gentleman, George Platter from Maryland, who wrote to Washington also suggesting the same character, as well as several other people. Thomas Lee Sims, and Thomas Jefferson, who came back from France with one person in mind, but seems to have changed his opinion because of what he heard about Fenwick. So Fenwick was a man of really high standing and respect, and George Washington did change him, although it is interesting that they accidentally wrote his brother James Fenwick in the letter to the House of Representatives, the letter to the Senate to be approved, but they quickly changed that the next day, realizing that James was in Maryland, not in France. So anyway, he does get accepted, and he works for about a decade as the consul to Bordeaux. George Mason's note also does specifically say that Joseph doesn't need money, but he would really benefit from the tax breaks you get as a diplomat of this nature. So he does this for about a decade, and then the quasi-war with France breaks out, and all of a sudden, there are some privateer ships, some French ships that are just capturing American vessels, and then it turns out that 10 sailors who were in the United States, they go to the government, they write a letter and say, hey, this captain captured our ship, and he mentioned that it was owned by Fenwick and Mason and Co. aka, they said it's owned by Joseph Fenwick. Isn't he a government employee in France? And they were like, oh yeah, he is a government employee in France. What is he doing capturing American ships? So John Adams quickly rescinds his position. He sends someone else, Thomas Crafts, I believe the name was, although Crafts dies before he gets there. But either way, he sends another letter through Timothy Pickering, actually, who we were just discussing, his Secretary of State acting on his behalf, saying, listen, even though your replacement's not there, you are no longer in this position. Now, Joseph Fenwick wants to defend himself, so he returns to the United States. And unfortunately, just as he's getting here to defend himself, well, suddenly in the newspapers there are people publishing saying that he was still acting in France as if he was consul and benefiting from the perks of being consul when he was no longer consul. So he gets home to defend one thing, and now there's this other accusation. Now he does publish in the newspapers defenses of himself. And essentially what he said was, listen, like, we're a part owner of this one ship. I did not give the captain instructions to capture the ship. I did not know that they were given a letter of marque to capture American ships. I had no idea about any of this. I'm a minority owner of this ship. Yes, I'm making money from it, but I'm not. I have nothing to do with its instructions. And reaction to this, kind of like today might go, fell mostly along party lines. Democratic Republicans said, yeah, he's okay, it's no big deal. And Federalists essentially said, no, it's not okay. And that's how it ended. He ends up going back to France and is very wealthy and successful. I'm sorry if that's anticlimactic. But it ended up being a little bit of a situation. Next week we are going to discuss James Monroe's time in Paris. And I will try and remember to bring this back up because Monroe, as we will see next week, does run into some trouble, and he ends up publishing critique of the administration, and Washington has notes, and essentially one of the things he says is that because of the Jay Treaty, in Monroe's opinion, because of the Jay Treaty, these American ships were getting captured by French ships, and it's overlapped too much because we're supposed to be friendly with France. And Washington specifically says, it was just this one time this happened. And it was after my administration, basically. We'll get to that next week. But now we're going to we went from Joseph Fenwick to Joseph Fenwick. Why is that? Because the Fenwick family of Catholics from Maryland was a bigger family. And I brought up Catholicism before because I forgot which Fenwick we were starting with because they have the same name. This one kind of matters. So Joseph Fenwick, about 20 years after the Revolution, again, it does seem to me he did participate briefly in the Revolution, though not a big part. But after the Constitution is established, Joseph Fenwick and his family move out to Kentucky. They're from Virginia. They're a wealthy family, but you know, this is obviously a big family and there's not enough wealth to go around. So they move to Kentucky to start their life, and they're there for a little while when Fenwick runs into a guy called De Lassus de Louziere. De Lassus de Louziere is a person who I know very little about. Doing the research for this article, I did learn a little about him. Seems to be a French person who came over to collect land that he had when France owned Missouri, which was kind of almost owned by Britain for a second, but then mostly now owned by Spain, and the Americans are starting to encroach. So this guy De Lassus owns this land. He goes to try and settle it, and he recruits the Fenwick family to come and help settle the land. And Fenwick does do this. He moves with his wife and his kids, and he convinces other families to come. They do bring several slaves. He had about a dozen slaves, I believe. In the end, he eventually gets about 25 families and about 78 slaves to form this community, as short-lived as it is. And we will get there. First, he goes to New Bourbon in Missouri, which was kind of the city that had been started at the time. He buys a house from a guy. They get into an argument, and he leaves. And he tries to settle one area, and then it's not perfect for him. And then he goes and settles another area right on the Mississippi. And this area becomes known as the Fenwick Settlement. So, Joseph Fenwick starts the Fenwick Settlement, and about, like I said, 20 families show up. It's right on the Mississippi River. They try and farm it. It's not a very good area for farming, and it's short-lived. They're about 10 years, and then everyone starts giving up, and the families filter away, although these families start being the first Americans to live in Missouri, which starts about middle to the end of the 1790s, and then within 10 years, the Louisiana Purchase has been made, and people are starting to go there. This is American territory now. So they were had the foresight that maybe they predicted the Louisiana Purchase. Impossible to know, but they did move out here. Now, it does seem that a major driving force for them was because both Spain and this Luzuri, the name I can't pronounce, Luzure, were Catholic, and they were Catholics. Interestingly, when they came out, they were known as either English Catholics or Maryland Catholics. They had a little bit more loose. They leaned a little more secular than the French or Spanish Catholics did at the time. I don't know how else to put that, so I'll say it like that. So Fenwick goes out there, and they establish Catholicism out there, essentially. Now, Fenwick does pass away, but his wife and his son end up keeping the Fenwick settlement, and it ends up being a spot for travelers on the Missouri River and the Mississippi River. It's right on the edge of the Mississippi. And it becomes kind of like a rest stop for travelers for a very long time. It becomes known for that throughout the first half of the 19th century. So, I know it's not the greatest story in the world, but again, they're really the first Americans to travel out to Missouri, so I did want to bring it to people's attention. There were two other settlements about the same time that I had passed through when I was researching this. Again, I know it's not the greatest story, but I read about a bunch of Joseph Fenwicks this week, last week, and I wanted to write about both of them. I thought it was interesting. After I say it now, it's a little bit more boring than it was when I was researching it. Thank you for sticking with me. Let's get to our last person, which is not boring, Moses Cleaveland. Now, I'm going to take a sip of water briefly, and definitely not choke on it, because I'm live on the interweb. Sorry about that. So, Moses Cleaveland. He's the founder of Cleveland. They're spelled differently, and we will get to that. But when Moses Cleaveland was a kid, he was going to Yale. And then the American Revolution broke out. And he finished his studies. I'm not going to join yet. I'm going to finish my studies. And then he did. He graduated from Yale. And what did he do? He joined the Continental Army. He actually joined as an ensign, which is the lowest ranking officer you could be, at least at the time. But he ends up getting promoted, becomes captain in the Corps of Engineers, led by Louis Duportel, who we just released a video about. Oh, that might be coming out tomorrow. Oh, look out for a Louis Duportel video tomorrow. Whoopsie daisy. Foreshadowing. I don't necessarily film them every day. Now you know. Some of my not live videos are, get this, not live. Cleveland fights in the war, does a good job. After the war, starts a law firm, becomes a leader in Connecticut society, gets appointed to the General Assembly for several years, goes to the ratification convention for the U.S. Constitution, where he votes for the Constitution. And he spends his whole time in the state militia. Eventually, he becomes a brigadier general in the state militia. So by 1796, he's done all this. He's a leader in his community, has a successful practice, brigadier general in the militia, and he started investing in land. And he invested in the Connecticut Land Company, which is one of two major Connecticut land companies. Now, Connecticut's original charter essentially said Connecticut owns where Connecticut is now to New York, and then skips over New York to where Pennsylvania starts now, and then goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Now, this caused conflict with Pennsylvania, as we've discussed in the past, in the Wyoming Valley, because that part of Pennsylvania, Connecticut used to think was theirs. Now, Connecticut ends up ceding most of its land. Most of the states ceded land when when the Articles of Confederation were ratified. Not even the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Though many private landowners continued to own this land. They just didn't own it in that state anymore. Now they owned it in the territories. And Connecticut, part of that Connecticut area was called New Connecticut, but at this point it had been shrunken down to part of Ohio that was called the Western Reserve. And the Connecticut Land Company, Moses Cleveland invested in, many people invested in. He was one of the highest investors, and as a high investor, a leader in the community, and a brigadier general in the state militia, he was asked to lead a team to explore this area. And he did. He led a team of 52 people, which actually includes 2 women who went with their husbands, which I thought was fascinating. You know, usually it was just a bunch of dudes going out for a while. But they did take 2 women, which was cool, and they went to Ohio. They took an interesting route. They went first to Schenectady, I believe, not Albany, Schenectady, which is just outside Albany, if you live anywhere but New York or New England, right by Albany. And they go up the Mohawk River to the Onondaga Lake and up the Oswego River to the Great Lakes. On their way up, they run into one tribe of Native Americans who I believe was one of the Iroquois nations. They run into them, and the Native Americans are like, "You're going to take our land? No, you can't come." And then Moses Cleveland was like, "Well, what if we trade you some stuff?" And the Native Americans were like, "Okay, you're going to go past our land anyway. You're going to the next land, right?" He's like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Okay." And they let him go. And then they go up to the Great Lakes, and they come down. Now, when you get to the Niagara Falls, you can't take a boat over Niagara Falls, not if you're a reasonable person. So they had to port their boats down, and they get down. And then there's another group of Native Americans there and the same conversation takes place. No, you can't go. What if we give you some stuff? Okay, go ahead. And they did. And they pull up to Lake Erie. They pull up to where Lake Erie meets, and I'm going to say this wrong, the Cuyahoga River. And they get off the boats there, and Moses Cleveland says, "This seems like a nice place to start a community." And he led the survey team, and they surveyed a team right there. And they laid out a piece of property that would be named after him, Cleveland, Ohio. Now, they did establish plots for people to buy. They also laid out a central park. I can't remember, what was it called? Public Square, which today still exists. It's called Monument Park, but it was known as Public Square. It still is informally known as Public Square, but now that there's monuments, including one of Moses Cleveland, it's officially known as Monument Park. And he did lay that out. Now, he was there less than a year, and most of the team returned back to Connecticut after that. In fact, Moses Cleveland returned to Connecticut and lived a nice, healthy life for several more years before he passed away of, I don't know what. But he, interestingly, he had only been there this one time, never saw a single building built left, but it was named in his honor. And now, his name has an A, Cleave, land. And there is no E in the city's name now. It seems to be a mistake on a map. He left, they named it after him, someone else wrote his name down when they made the first map, and that person didn't know how to spell Cleveland, and wrote it the way we spell it as a city now, forever tarnishing the legacy of Mr. Moses Cleveland. Just kidding, he has a city named after him. And you know what, I'm going to end with a fun fact. You might not know this about me. I was actually born in the city of Cleveland, which I only remembered now talking to you and not when I was writing the article the other day. I was 2 years old when I was relocated back to New York. So I don't know. My father was attending school at the time. So now you know my deep, dark secret. I was born in Cleveland. Not that deep and not that dark. If you guys have any questions, now would be a great time. I got through it a little quicker than normal, a little less than an hour. That's great. I'm sure there were announcements I should make. Oh, for those of you who play trivia, I realized that we had some people stepping on each other's toes last week. We unfortunately made Matt a villain for seemingly no reason. When we started trivia originally, I would let everyone answer, and then whoever got the right answer would get a point. We are going to go back to that format because I felt rude saying people didn't get the right answer, and I know we're having fun. I don't want it to be too much of a competition. Although I'm sure Matt will still win every week, which is fine. Thank you guys for watching. You know, when I sit down to start this, I'm always like, all right, at the end I'll say this and this and this, and now I'm like, I'm exhausted. I don't know what to talk about. If there's always, oh, Matt. yeah, I'm always open for questions. Find me on any social medias and the links below. Email me directly. That's fine. Call my mom, whatever you gotta do. Uh, so unless there's any other questions, I feel good about what we did here today. Uh, Lots of Joseph Fenwicks, a lot about Timothy Pickering, which I'm happy about because Timothy Pickering is one of those high level founders who's not on anyone's radar. Um, and Danny D. Tompkins is super interesting. He's not really a founder. He was a lot younger. Like I said, he was 43 in 1917 when he was elected president. So, like, doing math, he was a child through the Revolutionary War. But again, he's James Monroe's vice president for 8 years. And I guess that's it. So, thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to pop up my other screen here so I can, like, do it right. You guys are the best. Don't forget to like on your way out. If you're new here, subscribe. And I will see you with apparently a Louis Duportal video tomorrow and trivia on Friday. So for now, we will call it adieu and round bottom.